I wanted to give a reminder that closed captions are available at the bottom of your screen by clicking CC Live Transcript and then Show Subtitle. You can also adjust your subtitle settings to your preferences. Well, my name is Alondra. I want to introduce myself. My pronouns are she and her. I have been employed with the YWCA for quite some time now. I am a DV support advocate, so the few of the things that I do within my scope of work is providing advocacy for survivors of domestic violence. We basically do safety planning, exploring options, talking about resources in the community, but overall just being able to create a safe space for survivors to learn more about just psychoeducation surrounding domestic violence. But before we begin this event, I would like to begin this event with the land acknowledgement. We are gathered on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. More specifically, we acknowledge the Kalispel, Spokane, Colville, and Coeur d'Alene tribes, sovereign nations, who since time immemorial have been the caretakers of this region's lands and waterways. These tribal nations have made significant contributions to the vibrant fabric of our broader community. We honor and respect our enduring relationship with the tribes, the land, and the water. Also, if you're ever curious, if you want to know what native territories you're occupying, you can text your zip code to that number located on your screen. I also want to take this time to not only thank our panelists, but all the participants as well as who chose to be a part of this important conversation for a Domestic Violence Action Month campaign. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists of today's event. Logan and Kristina, would you like to come off your, turn your screen on and introduce yourselves?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kristina Hammond. I work with Lutheran Community Services. I've been an advocate both with intimate partner domestic violence and those who are later in life for the last 20 years.
Hello, my name is Logan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm one of the legal advocates here over at the YWCA. Well, I focus on going through the legal system with our survivors and navigating both the criminal courts as well as the civil courts.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. Like our Pathways Forward events, this discussion is going to include three parts. One of them is defining the problem, two, outlining some solution, and three, we'll hold some space for folks to answer some questions live as we're talking about this important topic. Over the course of this conversation, as questions come up, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so that we can answer as many of them as possible. Please also feel free to utilize the chat to feature and throw out any other thoughts or observations that you may have, and also to communicate with your fellow attendees. Be sure to direct your message to everyone, that way we know that we're able to see the chat. I'm moving on to the first part, which is defining the problem. We know that there could be, which we'll get into, but a lot of complexity surrounding DV reporting and how there's a variety of different outcomes that can happen when someone's considering reporting or domestic violence. I like to share some statistics about this particular issue. In the National Domestic Violence Hotline 2015 Law Enforcement Survey, survivors said that they were afraid of calling the police, which might result in either losing privacy, being stereotyped, having an abusive partner retaliate, or negatively affecting their children. And to further expand, we could see where some survivors may fear stigma or feel judged when seeking help. Oftentimes, if they're experiencing victim blaming, this could deter them from reporting domestic violence. While reporting abuse may seem like an option, there's a lot of fear and vulnerability and exposure that can hinder maybe someone's ability or willingness to come forward or ability. Another key factor that's mentioned is fear of retaliation. At times, maybe a survivor may feel unable to report the abuse due to threats from the perpetrator. The abuser could potentially utilize intimidation tactics such as threatening physical harm, maybe damaging property, or retaliating against loved ones to instill fear in the survivor. Another thing is another reason why survivors may choose to remain silent is just not knowing, what are the other options that are available to them. Another factor is considering the potential negative impact that it can have on their children, especially if we're getting other systems involved like law enforcement and other community systems. We never know what can result into the outcome of that situation. It could also expose children to secondary trauma and other forms of violence that maybe can overwhelm them with their instability and their safety net. But there's a lot of complexities that come around that, which we will talk a little bit more throughout this webinar today. Other thing I want to note is that domestic violence is an umbrella term referring to violence between individuals who are in proximity to each other, including dating or married partners, children, other older individuals, and even roommates. I think when we think about the definition of domestic violence, it can occur in many contexts, not just romantic ones. And this kind of shows a little bit more of how there's other forms of abuse that can happen: physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and many others. But by acknowledging the diversity in relationships that can come with domestic violence, we can maybe learn more of a scope of things of how the dynamics of each relationship can show up differently and how either it comes up for communities, social services, advocates, all of that. So now, Logan and Kristina, my question for you both is, in your line of work with survivors, why might someone choose to report or not report violence? Do you notice any patterns of reporting based on the population that you work with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to start with, to report why someone might want to report domestic violence is it comes down to personal safety. Immediate threat to a victim's personal and emotional safety is one of the primary reasons to report domestic violence. There are other things that also go into that as well. Sometimes breaking the cycle of abuse can start that process as well. Domestic violence often follows a cycle that escalates over time. Reporting can stop the progression and prevent further harm to a victim and potentially others in the household. One might report the violence so it doesn't happen again to themselves or others. Kristina, would you like to add some more?
Sure. Because I see a different populations and we see many multi-generational houses. There's some difficulty sometimes in reporting. We see those who are later in life who don't want to report because they don't want to lose their actual freedom, being able to live in their own home, having to possibly go into nursing care. There are multiple safety reasons. Even for young folks who might see their parent or loved one being abused or being the abuser, being arrested. There's many reasons to not report.
Thank Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna add, yeah, there's a lot of reasons for to not going and reporting and stuff like that. A lot of times there could be fear. There could be consequences if they decide to leave the relationship. This could be fear of the partner's actions or concerns over their own ability to be independent.
Those are all great thoughts. So thank you both for sharing your insight with that. Now that we've overall defined the problem, I want to transition our conversation just a little bit about exploring solutions. We encourage you all to, for the folks out there watching and listening in, to encourage you to continue submitting your questions at the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we will be answering some of those soon. Now, to further our conversation for Kristina and Logan, how do victims advocates educate and empower survivors in this situation?
So a lot of, let me just go ahead and How do we educate and empower? I think talking to each individual person on the direct um, safety issues that are involved for them, their circumstances. It is very, each person's so multifaceted and their lives are multifaceted. So being able to look at their whole life in an entirety and being able to help them navigate things, to help them decide what will be safe for them.
Absolutely. When it comes into like the legal field, advocates can be extremely helpful, especially when it comes to navigating both the criminal and the civil side of the justice system. The legal field is and can be difficult to navigate without almost having like a guide to help move them through the system. Um, Whether you're using legal or victim advocates, they can help survivors navigate both the systems to understand the processes, whether that's going to a court, maybe meeting with law enforcement, meeting with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and or other court staff as well. This also allows the survivor to ultimately be heard when it comes to the justice system. It's kind of like a backwards kind of system when we go into the criminal justice. It's all suddenly all about the perpetrator, in this case the defendant. That person gets an attorney on their behalf. There's a prosecutor. A lot of times that prosecutor is actually more for the state rather than the victim or the survivor in this case. So sometimes that can be very confusing and difficult to navigate. So that's where we can come in as legal advocates or just advocates in general to allow the survivor to be heard, to be able to get the knowledge that they may need. So this can go from maybe how was the perpetrator arrested? When will they be released? Is there a bond in place? And what is a bond? How do I get the information on where this person's going to be released and when? Sometimes they can sign up for something called Bind Link, and that allows them to get that information, whether that's through text messages, maybe through phone calls, to allow to get that information of like, oh, yep, so and so is going to be released soon or eventually on that. It also just allows the survivor to be understood through the complex justice system that can empower the survivor to feel supported and understood.
So there's also the other systems in our that people will be confronted with, such as APS or CPS, where giving as much information, helping them think out the ramifications of reporting. What will this look like? How um, will it look to law enforcement? How will it look to CPS? What will happen if I go further? Will there need to be civil court hearings for parenting plans? Will my children be taken away? Helping them think out all of the ramifications of just that one reporting incident will help them, and they can help safety plan. APS is one also that is tricky to kind of navigate sometimes. Just helping them understand what will happen if they do make those reports and giving them options. I think a lot of times when somebody's in a power and control relationship, all options are taken away or you don't feel like you have options. So giving survivors as many options as possible is really important.
I think to further expand on that with both what Logan and Kristina are saying is, at least as far as the advocacy and what I see in my work is being able to provide that safe space initially of like what creating that safety plan with them. And we do know that survivor circumstances are all unique to their own situations. And even just educating them on, like you mentioned, like the parent control wheel, what are other forms of abuse that show up in that relationship dynamic? Because I think an important piece to being able to help navigate their options on whether they decide to report or not, but just overall so they're empowered to make the decision since they get that choice to do what's next. So next question. Beyond potentially legal support, what long-term solutions could support survivors who may want to report abuse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are some other solutions that we can look into, and this can be focusing on addressing their emotional, economic, and social needs. When it comes to like that emotional side of things, it would be nice to see more trauma-informed counseling and therapy. For individual therapy, this can help survivors process this trauma of abuse, develop coping strategies, and regain their emotional well-being. Another thing that can go into like the economic empowerment programs, as well as just like that job training and education, providing access to skills training, education, and career counseling can empower survivors to become financially independent, making it easier for them to leave abusive situations and sustain themselves as well. Going into that social needs as well, kind of going into that community-based support, going into maybe support groups is a huge thing. Establishing connections with other survivors or community advocates can provide ongoing emotional and practical support. These networks can also help reduce isolation and create a sense of belonging as well.
Yes, I see a lot of benefits in working with the social supports. There during COVID, there was Check and Connect for those who were later in life, so that more people had eyes on. I think it's also very important in the school systems to have um, children who are going through family violence to be able to have that support as well. There are many areas that we can focus on that do not rely on the legal system. Um, the legal system, a lot of times for clients that I work with, does not feel like a very safe system. Um, Even though it's meant to be, it doesn't feel that way all the time. So being able to explore and also to have that social support is very important.
Those are all very great points from you both. Are there any specific policy changes at the local, state, or federal level that could improve the legal process for handling domestic violence cases?
Yeah, I believe there can be. I think one of the things that can be something more of a change right now is strengthening protection orders. These things should be more enforced violations nationwide. So improving interstate enforcement of restraining orders and protection orders through better communication and coordination between different states would help ensure that protective orders are respected across state lines. Improving police and judicial training can also be a beneficial thing as well. Just mandating training on trauma and domestic violence dynamics. Police officers, judges, legal professionals could benefit from additional training focused on the psychological and the physical effects of domestic violence, trauma-informed care, and the dynamics of the coercive control. This would help handle cases more sensitively and make informed decisions that better help protect survivors. Alongside that, it would also be nice to see culture competency training. Incorporating culture competency training in law enforcement and judicial systems would ensure that marginalized or minority communities receive fair treatment, that their unique challenges are understood. Another thing that I also want to touch into as well is kind of bringing up mandated arrest laws as well. When it comes to mandated arrest, if there is allegations of some physical violence, that one person would be arrested, and that would be the primary aggressor. It's difficult to also clarify who the primary aggressor is, so maybe clarifying that law as well when it comes to clearer definitions of the primary aggressor can help police identify the main perpetrator of violence, reducing the likelihood of wrongful arrests of victims as well.
Most of our laws and our policies were developed many years ago, and they haven't been updated or re-looked at. I think that victims' voices have been left out of the ideas and the thoughts of um, what should happen. And I agree with mandated reporting. It really needs to be looked at. There's so many different ramifications of somebody protecting themselves and looking like the main aggressor. Um, there's a lot of policies that we could use locally, statewide, and nationally that really should be looked at with a victim's lens, where they have not been looked at as a victim's lens. They always look at defending the defendant, making sure all of their rights are protected. So it would be wonderful to have policy changed, but having victim voice in it, because it will look different.
Right. And so for Logan, my question for you is, have you ever worked with victims who have been arrested themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do see that in the line of work. Sometimes the perpetrator will either lie or say something different to law enforcement, and law enforcement ends up arresting the victim in these cases, believing that they are the perpetrator, unfortunately. Sometimes prosecution can quickly catch that, nope, we actually have the wrong person, and so they can dismiss those cases. But going through that process is already traumatizing as it is. Imagine being a survivor of domestic violence, and all of a sudden you're now being arrested for domestic violence because your perpetrator had said something different or did something different to law enforcement. Now you're sitting in jail or you are being arrested at that point. That can be super traumatizing during that process. And then not getting those answers, going through the system and everything, and trying to say like, hey, I'm the innocent one, like I'm the one being abused, and no one listening to you at that point. So that can be extremely difficult.
Kristina, does Lutheran have services for victim defendants at all?
Of course, we work with each person individually. We do see some of the same things, although we don't work with intimate partner. Working with somebody who might be later in life, you might see that they have defended themselves in a situation where their adult child is at their home, or their grandchild, and it might look a little bit differently to law enforcement. I've also seen folks who are going through dementia that have been arrested because law enforcement may not have been really up to date or understand the the dementia aspect of something, of the situation. And it is definitely something that, as at LCS, that we are able to help work with somebody who has been arrested. We don't work on the victim side. We work on we work on the victim side. Sorry about that. Um, and a lot of times we actually already know that there's something going on. They've probably already been a client of ours as well already. So we've already seen the pattern. But we definitely will work with somebody if they are the victim.
And just to kind of process a little bit more about mandated reporting, how although we know that the policy and laws that were put in place, let's say decades ago, were made as an intervention, right, to kind of help survivors in these circumstances, or and to see how there's still gaps as time's moving on, just kind of can make it difficult for one to best prepare of like, who do I go to? Do I report to the police? What are my options? How do I document something like this? It just becomes very hard to know what to do. But thank you all for your insight so far. My next question is, what can we individually do to better support survivors in our lives? In reference to like the community.
Definitely think that listening to their stories, um, and then asking what they need. What do you need? How can we support you as a community? That is a good way to start. Um, and understanding that we all can have a great impact in our community, by being a voice, by educating ourselves on what domestic violence is, whether it is somebody who's later in life or somebody who's very, very young in life. Um, the more education you have about what domestic violence is, the more you can help the community.
Yeah, I definitely second all of those. I also want to add just being like acknowledging that survivors are in a difficult and scary situation, and then letting them know that the abuse is not their fault. Also be non-judgmental, respect the decision that the survivor ultimately makes. There are many reasons why someone does end up staying in an abusive situation. They may leave and then return to the relationship many times, but remember not to criticize the decisions or guilt them. They'll need your support more than ever during these moments. Another thing is that we can also say is I also agree that we should learn a little bit more into domestic violence and understanding it as a community and being there to support survivors and walk alongside them.
Yeah, and I think another way we're to better support survivors of domestic violence is just kind of having conversations like the one we're having now. Having events like this where we're continuing education and just raising awareness on what is going on. Also considering even holding maybe our community partners accountable, maybe collaborating with one another, whether that's facilitating events together, continued education. I know we, especially throughout this month, we've been offering DV 101 and 201 events as well, where we're talking about more in depth of the parent control wheel and different levels of abuse and how that shows up. But I think so far, everything that you've both been saying, like those are great ways to support, or as a community, that we can continue these conversations and support survivors of DV. Especially, when there's certain systems that kind of place blame on the survivor, when in reality, we got to shift the focus to the perpetrator being held accountable, right? And it's interesting how that still happens and how there's a lot of myths and when we're thinking about DV. But thank you both. So now we're shifting this section to answering questions from participants. It looks like some of you have been sending great questions. Please continue doing so, and we'll be answering them as many as we can starting now. So someone asked, how would you respond to a question such as, why don't you, the victim, just call the cops?
Yeah, first, I actually want to reframe our thinking. The question is not why does the victim just leave? The better question is why the abuser chooses to abuse. The deck is stacked against the survivor as they navigate safety. Also, this question is difficult for a survivor to answer. There are so many reasons why someone may not call law enforcement or another entity to help. As we previously established, there's a lot going on that someone may not see on the outside or be aware of. Best practice is to be supportive of the survivor's decision and seeing if they would like to be you to be there with them when they speak with law enforcement or another entity within the system as well.
I don't think I could have answered that better. Thank you, Logan. There are so many ways, so many reasons why somebody may or may not report, um, or just call the cops. They don't always know themselves all the different reasons. And so for us to just be supportive and stop putting the blame on the victim for not calling the police, um, we should be addressing more of the fact that the person who is abusing, not that the person isn't calling the police.
I really like how you reframe that question. Like, I think that can have an impact, especially as we're sharing and having this conversation about, yeah, it's focusing more on what the survivor has to do in reality. It's more of what the perpetrator has to do to stop continuing uh, perpetrating more violence in the home. The next question from someone is, what services are available for perpetrators who are looking to get help to unlearn their behaviors, etc.? As a sub-part of this question is how often do abusers change, and what, if anything, can we do to encourage change?
Logan, I'll go ahead and let you answer this one. For the populations that I work with, it's a little bit different than those who are working intimate partner domestic violence. Um, we do see change. I've seen some amazing things that have happened, but a lot of times the population that I mostly work with, being later in life, it is a lot of times it's their family member who's living with them, and then when they start getting mental health help or substance abuse help, a lot of times that behavior will change, and there's a huge regret and um a a lot of healing that can take place. And I think that it we see it more in later in life, when it's not intimate partners, then Logan's experience might be a little bit different. So
Yeah, I would say that one of the things I want to say is I think people can change. Um, that is something that I think a majority of us are also striving for to see change in people. I do believe that there are different like peer support out there for perpetrators, and they can seek counseling as well. I think it also stems through of going down to the root question of, again, why does the abuser choose to abuse, and really kind of figuring out why that question needs to be answered. And so that's kind of where that goes into. I believe that there are systems that are trying to help perpetrators through the system. There are some things that can definitely be changed in them, of course, but going through those processes and ultimately holding the abuser or the perpetrator accountable for their actions is going to be huge for those people. Just because, like, we also need to hold people accountable and their responsibilities for their own actions. I can only change what I can do. So when someone does something, that they can change that as well. So I think that goes to that question. Another thing is, I think just going through and really talking about healthy relationships and having healthy kind of conversations around that at the early age is something that can also help prevent that to occur as well.
Yeah, and to expand on what you're saying, Logan, is I do think that even something as like preventative education when we're talking to youth or about healthy relationships and what that looks like, because oftentimes there might be people out there that don't have, let's say, a idea of what a healthy relationship is, or what does it mean to be in a relationship? What does it look like to love ourselves, love the people that we're with, what are boundaries in a relationship. Oftentimes when we think of boundaries, people may find it as, oh, it's something that we can't do, or we always have to be open. But honestly, setting boundaries is what can maintain our overall well-being just as people. So I really like that point that you brought out. I do think that that is an important piece that should be talked more often. Next question is, why, after reporting to police, do we need to speak to ADA? Speak and recall events just provokes PTSD. Can't they just use BWC and get the idea of abuse that happened?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Sometimes when law enforcement shows up to an incident, the incident may have stopped or cooled down. So if there is body camera footage, sometimes that footage is just the setting of where the incident was or is, and then the interviews with the perpetrator, the victim, and or other witnesses that may be there as well. When it comes to the setting, law enforcement and the camera may only see the example like broken glass. Both entities, law enforcement or the camera, may not have seen how or why the broken glass became broken. When it comes to chatting with the involved parties, there can be a lot of different emotions happening all at once, which may be confusing to sort out as well. So when it comes to speaking with the prosecutor, it is their job to prosecute the perpetrator. In order to do this, they need to understand kind of what happened. A survivor can request to have their advocate to be with them during this meeting. Now, the advocate can't speak for the survivor on what kind of happened, but they can advocate for the well-being of the survivor, if they need to take a quick break or just kind of gauging how the interview is going and everything. So another reason for a prosecutor to chat with a survivor is to prepare for trial. Now, just because prosecution or defense is chatting with a survivor does not mean it's automatically going to trial. There's a lot of other things that are going on as well, but a lot of times it's just both sides wanting to know what the survivor can recall in the events and understand their side of the story. Both sides of the prosecution and defense is just trying to understand that this can be extremely stressful and it can bring up unwanted feelings. So they do try to be respectful when it comes to speaking with survivors and trying to really understand what happened during those incidents.
I think this is a really great point to kind of go back to policy change. I think it's very important for our prosecutors to understand what happens with a brain that has been through a traumatic experience, so that they are a little more, I know they have what they need to get in order to prosecute um, something that has happened, but we also need to understand how to question, how to find out those answers so that it doesn't cause more trauma, and also understanding how a trauma brain thinks and understand that things may not always come out in a linear way or the way that you think it should come out or that law enforcement should have thought something should come out. We have to understand how trauma affects our brain so that we can understand how we can go forward with prosecution and how to make things a little easier for those who are surviving.
Great points. Next question from the community is, what constitutes a mandated report?
Wow, I get to do those all the time. Um, so any abuse of a minor or somebody who is a vulnerable adult has to be reported. And because something has to be reported, I do like to caution somebody who's talking to us on the phone because I want them to have their options. I It's really hard when I have to make that report. I prefer to make that report with the person that I'm working with, so that it's not as shocking to them. Um, And also, there's some really interesting because I do get to work with some vulnerable adults, and there's some apps out there now that can actually explain what abuse is, what it looks like, and we can go through it together to see if that is what's going on and how we can report it to law enforcement or APS or CPS, depending on the person. But always think it's better to have the permission from the person being abused. I know that I am a mandated report and I'll do it anyways, but I would rather walk side by side with somebody so they feel that support than just making the report.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there, Christina. I think also when it comes to a mandated report, both for CPS and then adult protective services as well. We're looking for like, is there any physical violence? Is there any neglect? And some of the other things in there as well. And so that can be a very difficult conversation to have with someone. What I usually end up seeing is usually CPS reports and stuff like that. I do also agree that it's one of those things to also inform the person you're speaking with, like, hey, I'm gonna have to make a mandated report. If you would like to continue, let's continue this conversation. If you want to terminate this conversation, let's go ahead and terminate this conversation. Because that one not only empowers our clients to figure out what they want to do moving forward, it also gives them that autonomy ability to make those decisions as well. So that's a huge thing to go moving forward and stuff like that, because sometimes when these reports do get going and everything, it actually can make more problems than actually solutions for the people going through these and the ones involved as well.
Christina, I'm not sure if this is something that you've had an experience with, but we had somebody ask, what about an unregistered sex offender? Is this something to report as a mandated reporter?
It is not a mandated report. That's I'm gonna leave that up to the person. Um, you do if you see something that's wrong, do you see it and say it and address the situation? But it is not a mandated report. They're looking at specific abuse, um, neglect, um, and just not registering that it is a crime, but it is not a mandated report.
And I think also to keep in mind that, just to clarify that domestic violence between adults or peers is not considered a mandated report, at least for what I also do in advocacy, is what could maybe also qualify a mandated report more is if there's harm caused to the maybe children involved, if there is any, minors in the home. But just specifically, just to point out, it's not a mandated report for adults and peers that are involved with domestic violence. Now let's see the next question.
Actually, if they are intimate partners and they are over 60 and one of them has a caregiver or is in some way vulnerable, it is a mandated report, even if it is domestic violence. So that's the only time.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Next question here is when to report child mental and psychological abuse while keeping the child safe from the verbal retaliation from the other parent. Mental health professionals are involved, but children will not speak of or about parent doing the verbal or psychological abuse. Pretty big one.
Yeah, so definitely a difficult question and everything. I do know that when it comes to speaking with minors in these situations, there are specifically trained people to go through those kind of conversations, especially when it comes to anything of like physical, sexual harm or anything like that. There is a way of interacting with a child in those kind of conversations, because sometimes when you are talking with a child, you can sometimes influence their answers in the way of your questioning. So you got to be very specific in those. I'm not trained in how those processes work and stuff like that, but I do know that there are specific training out there for those people that go through those kind of conversations.
Yes, the Child Advocacy Center is the ones who do the interviewing for law enforcement. It's set up through law enforcement or CPS, and it's done at Partners with Family and Children. And they are highly trained, and they do it on a daily basis, and they are the experts in their field. I definitely would not want to um, go beyond what I'm, my scope. We all have different roles to play in this, and they are amazing, and they help a child feel comfortable and don't, it doesn't feel for the child that they're tattling on one parent or the other. That can be very problematic when you are tattling on your parent, your dad, your mom. um, it makes you feel bad, and we don't want any extra trauma happening to the child. So definitely, I wouldn't question a child. Um, Most law enforcement just do very little, and then they send it over to the Child Advocacy Center.
Question is, what is the best thing to do when a patient lets you know that they are in a DV situation but are not able to ever speak to you alone?
Wow, each one of those, I mean, that's kind of a complicated question because if you're not able to speak with the person alone, I don't want to read into things that are happening, but I definitely try to arrange a time that I can go to coffee or to lunch where it's not feeling like I am the the bad guy to the perpetrator. And hopefully that will create a safe place for us to go. We've gone to the library, we've gone to many different public places. Um, yeah, that's I can't move forward without knowing what the client wants to have happen. So if they can't talk to me, that is very hard. And so I may ask a few questions, but I also might say, hey, is there somebody close to you that you can talk to that might be a little bit better than me to help you through whatever support you need, suggesting, a family member or sometimes somebody from their church or their faith or maybe a neighbor. Um, yeah, that's kind of a difficult situation to be in.
Yeah, definitely agree to all of those as well. One of the things that I thought of as well is seeing if the perpetrator can leave somehow, if you can have them leave in an appropriate manner as well, especially in a public place. Maybe you can find them to, hey, can you go grab X, Y, and Z real fast, and see if that helps a little bit, to see if you can get that other person out of the room, and then see if you can chat with the client at that point. But yeah, it's definitely difficult if the client is unable to speak about what's going on, because you're not going to know what's going on at that point.
Thank you both. And I think our last question from the public is, what might a survivor recant their report in court?
Yeah, sometimes survivors will uh, change their conversation with prosecution or with defense and stuff like that. Many times it's because they feel this shame or this guilt, or there's other complex issues that are going on outside that we may not be aware of. So going into like that shame or guilt side of things, sometimes the survivor will be like, well, so and so called me. They're really upset that I'm pursuing the charges. They're not pursuing the charges. The state or whoever the entity that happened in the occurred area is pursuing those charges. And so those charges, again, are being pursued by the state, and they are moving forward with those. So that can be a huge thing to see as well. And then that just like that shame and guilt of like, well, I threw them in prison or I threw them in jail or something like that. I got them in trouble. And that's not necessarily true. Again, it goes back to we can only control our actions, and the perpetrator must take accountability to those actions. When it comes to those other complex things as well, we don't often see the outside kind of thoughts of the issues when it comes to those protections for the survivor, especially with like protection orders or no contact orders. Suddenly, when like for example, a no contact order gets put in place, and that's usually by a judge through a criminal proceeding, we don't see that, oh, well, so and so was going to pay rent this month. I don't have that money to pay rent. How am I supposed to get rent money to be paid suddenly? And that can make a huge issue for the survivor trying to figure out, okay, I don't have the money to pay rent. I need to find a job. Oh, I've got kids now involved. How am I going to get childcare taken care of? And all those things suddenly becomes this ginormous weight on the shoulders of the survivor. And so that can be a huge situation to navigate as well. And so sometimes they believe that if they can remove the criminal case moving forward and stuff like that, and remove that no contact order, that will help bring back the safety net of that economic solutions that they're looking for as well.
When we are working with sexual assault survivors, we see a lot of recantation, and there are many different reasons for recantation as well. Um, the criminal process can take a very long time, especially if it's a felony. And so weary, people get weary. Also, if their name has been dragged through the media a lot, it is embarrassing. Everybody knows. You can't get away from it. And so they just want those things to stop. A lot of times, just even calling the police were to stop the actions from happening in that very moment. And with a protection order, a lot of times things stop. And so sometimes things get better, even though they have a no contact order. Sometimes it actually gets better. And so they then want things to stop again and want to try again, which it doesn't matter what somebody else might think. It's up to them. So that recantation definitely can happen there as well. There's so many different dynamics. If you're the person that is abusing you is going to the doctors to pick up your prescriptions, or is the one that goes and gets your meals at the grocery store because you can't drive, you definitely are tempted to recant.
Thank you both for providing your insight. Well, thank you all of you for those questions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to answer any more at this moment, but we really appreciate your engagement here today with us. As we start to bring this event to a close, I would like to ask each panelist to give their key takeaway from this conversation. And the question is, what are things we can leave with today to help us pave pathways forward in our community? And what gives you hope?
I definitely believe that educating ourselves as a community is going to be the best way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I want to say is no one deserves to be abused. The abuse is not your fault. You are not alone.
And I like to add, I think what gives me hope is just continuing more conversations like this, and even just being here as a moderator, I even got some ideas from even the community and just panelists overall of some more creative ways to provide safety planning for the people that we work with. So I'm really excited for that. So thank you so much for your responses. I feel inspired. I want to thank you all for participating in this panel. It will be recorded and shared with all registrants via email soon, and we will be sharing it all over our social media channels as well. If you found it valuable, please consider it sharing with other people. And last thing I'd like to add is during Domestic Violence Action Month and beyond, we hope that you join us in raising awareness and supporting survivors. You can learn more about our 2024 DVAM campaign on our website. And one of the ways you can support survivors is by helping to ensure YWCA's services remain available. You can make a gift at ywcaspokane.org/give. And with that being said, we're so grateful for such a supportive community and know that together we can move through the needle on domestic violence in Spokane. Thank you for all that you do, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday.